The model at Port Arthur had a slightly longer barrel in this one, but in essence, this was virtually identical to the rifle that was fired at Port Arthur, with the addition of a scope that was mounted on the top. Most of the witnesses described the shooter as firstly being right-handed, whereas Martin Bryant was left-handed, and shooting the rifle not from the shoulder, but from the hip. Welcome to the Wasp Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised. Like everything associated with the Port Arthur Massacre, the firearms that were used prior to and during the shooting remain shrouded in mystery. Who owned them? Where did they come from? How did they make their way down to Port Arthur and into the arms of someone who would use them against the civilian population? And what happened to them after the shooting had ended. But first, a little bit of education about the firearms used at Port Arthur. The main rifle that was used was the Colt SP1 high-powered semi-automatic rifle. It has a 30-round magazine, pistol grip, and a cyclopedic retractable stock, which would enable a shooter to be able to gain greater accuracy when firing the rifle from the shoulder. The serial number of the firearm that was used at Port Arthur was SP1-28807. The model at Port Arthur had a slightly longer barrel in this one, but in essence, this was virtually identical to the rifle that was fired at Port Arthur, with the addition of a scope that was mounted on the top of the hand grip. It's a very compact rifle, as you can see, with the stock fully retracted. It could easily be concealed in a sports bag, which it was on the day. It has some advantage. It's very lightweight, very easy to wield, has a front sight, post sight, and has the advantage of having an ambidextrous cocking mechanism at the rear of the handle. This means that you don't have a mechanism to operate the bolt from the left or the right hand side, but both. So in essence, to cock the rifle, you would basically draw back on the cocking mechanism, release it, and you could fire the rifle, whether you were left or right-handed, which does have some bearing on the nature of the shooter. One perhaps disadvantage with the Colt SP1 is that the ejection port, where the empty brass cases are ejected every time a round is fired, is only on the right-hand side of the rifle. So when the rifle is fired, this plate would drop down and the empty brass cases would eject across out of the chamber. And if you were shooting from the right hand, if you're a right-handed shooter, you could see that you could pull the trigger and eject the cases and there wouldn't be any distraction or any interference coming from what was flying out of that port. However, if you were a left-hand shooter, as Martin Bryant was, and you were firing the rifle from your left shoulder, you would have brass cases, hot gas, and perhaps powder residue and bits of burnt gunpowder emitting on a rapid repeating rate from that port, which could then, technically speaking, cause some distraction to your aim and your ability to be able to control the rifle. As a result of that, most of the witnesses described the shooter as firstly being right-handed, whereas Martin Bryant was left-handed, and shooting the rifle not from the shoulder, but from the hip. So that way, if there was any kind of impediment that would be caused by the ejection from that side of the port, that certainly wouldn't be a case if the rifle was fired in this manner. Obviously, firing a rifle at hip height would be quite difficult to be able to hit targets, even though most of the targets were taken at broad arrow and at close ranges, including, under a metre. So technically at hip height, you would be basically elevated at the same level as somebody seated in a chair. And it is possible, of course, at those ranges to be able to utilise a firearm from hip shooting and to take out as many people as you could at head height. Most of the victims at Broad Arrow Cafe were shot at head height and hit in the head, which is still a remarkable feat for someone who isn't highly trained using this rifle. It is not an M16 rifle, as sometimes confused. The M16, although virtually identical to the Colt SP1, is the rifle that was commonly seen during the Vietnam War and carried by troops. It is virtually identical to the Colt SP1. The main difference being that the M16 rifle is a selective fire rifle, which means that as well as being semi-automatic, it is also fully automatic, i.e. a machine gun. So the difference being that with a semi-automatic rifle, you have to pull the trigger each time to loose off a shot. So it would be bang, 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 bang. You can still shoot rapid fire as fast as you can pull the trigger. The M16, once it's on fully automatic selection, you just have to depress and hold the trigger, and the rifle will fire all rounds very rapidly without you having to just constantly keep pulling the trigger. Contrary to popular belief, and of course the media hysteria, the Colt SB1, which is also known as an AR-15, AR is a variant of the style of rifle, so the Colt SB1 is a variant on the AR-15 style rifle. AR doesn't stand for assault rifle. It stands for Armalite rifle, which is the manufacture of the style of weapon, if you like. So the gun itself was purposed for the civilian market initially as a sporting and recreational firearm. It was not designed as a wartime weapon. Despite that, even though it was a civilian marketed rifle, in any hands, in the wrong hands, any rifle can be exceedingly lethal and dangerous. And given its capacity to have a 30-round magazine and to be quite compact, it is a devastating weapon, as was seen at Port Arthur. The Colt SB1 utilizes the .223 caliber round, which is a high-powered round, a centerfire round, and it is a civilian version of the military virtually identical round known as the NATO 5.56 by 45. The two rounds are virtually identical, but there are differences in tolerances and measurements. So if using military ammunition in a civilian manufactured weapon that was designed to take .223, there may be some issues with feeding and jamming. Hence the NATO rounds are usually reserved for use in military weapons such as the M16. The rounds that were used at Port Arthur were, however, Chinese military rounds. They were known as the Norinco rounds, and they were 5.56 by 45. So there didn't seem to be much problems with the Colt SB1 feeding and functioning with those military rounds. It was fairly common round to buy, fairly cheap. You could buy them in bulk back then, and they did seem to function in civilian rifles, though they were principally designed for use in military rifles. So even though this weapon was, or this firearm, I'd like to say, was considered to be a civilian model, obviously the .223 caliber round, when utilised against a person, can cause catastrophic damage, particularly at close range. And that can be more accurately demonstrated by the tests that were carried out on ballistic gel dummies, which we'll show now. Law-abiding firearm owners are often demonised every time there is criminal use of a firearm, particularly resulting in a large loss of life. Law-abiding firearm owners, of course, procure their firearms for benevolent purposes. They're licensed, they go through all the safety checks, the security checks, and store their firearms safely, locked away, and they use them for recreation, farming purposes, target shooting, hunting, etc. Unfortunately, there are people out there that procure firearms, whether illegally or otherwise, and use them for not so gentle purposes. And these individuals often impact law-abiding firearm community in a very negative manner. Generally, the media are fairly hostile towards shooters, and this was certainly the case with Port Arthur. Port Arthur at the time was the biggest mass killing by a lone gunman in world history at the time, and the large resultant loss of life, the tragedy of that crime caused an unprecedented move to basically control firearms in Australia. This led to the banning of high-powered semi-automatic rifles such as the Colt SP1 and pump-action shotguns, and placed a requirement for people who wish to own firearms legally to go through some of the most stringent gun control measures in the world. But the Colt SP1, where did it come from? Back in 1996, laws were not as tough as they are now. Australia has some of the toughest gun laws in the world. In 1991, Tasmania was basically under the control of the Guns Act 1991, which still required shooters to have a licence and to be a fit and proper person to own a firearm as deemed by the Chief Commissioner of Police. Despite that, certain states within Australia were a lot looser with their firearm laws than other states. Principally Queensland and Tasmania were known to basically have fairly loose firearm laws in that sense. And in terms of the regulation of firearms, there were other ways that you could procure firearms without having to go through a complicated licensing process. One of those was that you could purchase firearms from private owners out of the Trading Post and advertisements in the Mercury, and although they were supposed to go through a process of registration, often they did not. So, of course, as we know, back in the day, the New South Wales Premier at the time, Barry Unsworth, was famous as quoted, "There will never be uniform gun laws in Australia until we see a massacre in Tasmania." At the time, the state premiers were, in essence, arguing about implementing uniform gun laws on a national basis, and Queensland and Tasmania were balking at some of the restrictions. Even though since Port Arthur we now have, in essence, uniform gun laws, you will still find today that there are not totally uniform laws, that each state has their own specific characteristics as to the licensing and regulation of firearms. But in 1996, there were some questions asked about where this high-powered AR-15 rifle came from. It turned out that the firearm was handed in to the Victoria Police in 1987 by Yea farmer Bill Drysdale, who recognised the firearm when he saw it on the television when it was held by the Ballistics, Taspol ballistics expert Gerard Dutton, and he recognised the firearm by a unique gunsmith's mark on the barrel. AR-15s and their equivalent were relatively rare birds in Australia. They were available, but not in any large number. So Bill was told when he handed in his AR-15, which he used for farming purposes up in Yea, Victoria, that the weapon would be destroyed. And he handed it in 1987 under John Cain's ban. This was following the Hoddle and Queen Street massacres that occurred in Melbourne around that time. So the first states really to implement strict firearm banning on high-powered semi-automatic rifles were Victoria as a result of those shootings. It turned out that the firearm that was handed in by Bill was not destroyed but was kept and given to the Victorian Special Operations Group, SOG Police, along with 17 other confiscated and or handed in high-powered semi-automatic rifles. The SOGs kept the firearms as their own personal weapons and illegally registered them through the Victorian Licensing Regulation Division. They held on to these firearms for quite some time before the department was upgraded with the new Steyr AUG F88 rifles, and my understanding was that they had sold the confiscated weapons, including the AR-15 that was handed in, to a gun dealer in Bendigo by the name of Garnet Featherstone of Granite Arms. Garnet had contracts with the police and the military, and he provided a lot of more tactical type firearm and accessories to those organisations. So the SOGs had sold the AR-15 along with the other rifles for approximately $34,000, I believe, to Garnet Featherstone in Bendigo, Victoria. Garnet then on-sold all of those firearms down to Tasmania. The history and origins of the Colt SP1 that was used at the Port Arthur Massacre was investigated by the Herald Sun back in the day. They had determined that the gun had been handed in Victoria. The Assistant Police Commissioner David Sinclair at the time held a conference and confirmed and acknowledged that the firearms had in fact been kept and used by the SOGs and then on-sold. So that was basically determined and acknowledged by the Victoria Police. So in answer to who put the gun back on the street, it wasn't the law-abiding shooters, it was the Victoria Police. I do have some evidence that was put forward by someone that they were working at the time for Garnet, and they came in, saw the firearms and said, what are all these firearms? And were told that they had been sold to a collector directly down at Seascape, meaning Seascape Cottage. Now that draws a bit of a line between the firearm being handed in Victoria, and rather than going down through gun dealers, went straight down to a collector at Seascape. That's yet to be determined, as many of the questions are about the firearms used at Port Arthur, because we never had an open trial or an inquest or a royal commission. However, the bottom line was that the Colt SB1 ended up down in Tasmania and in the hands of Martin Bryant. Martin Bryant did own that firearm. Martin Bryant was not licensed. He did not have a gun license, nor did he have a driver's license. At the time, there were gun dealers, of course, down in Tasmania, and one of these, who we spoke about in earlier episodes, Terry Hills, was accused of being the gun dealer who sold the Colt SB1 to Martin Bryant under the counter. Terry Hills reported that a man came in with long blonde hair who had one of the new plastic firearm licenses that had just been issued with a red restrictive bar on it, which authorised the bearer to use both semi and fully automatic weapons to purchase them and use them. The licence was apparently made out to a Martin Ryan. So given that the police have confirmed that Martin didn't have a licence, the question remains, who was the person who came into the store and how did they have a licence that enabled them to purchase semi and fully automatic rifles? Despite that, Terry Hills, although being accused of the person who sold the AR-15 to Martin Bryant, denies that he did so, under the counter or otherwise. And there is some further evidence coming out which I will be detailing a little later on about the origins of that firearm, where they went and how they ended up in Martin Bryant's possession and whether or not the firearms that were shown were in fact those firearms that were used. There was some reports, as mentioned before, that there may have been a fake firearm licensing scam operating down in Tasmania. They would have been the laminated plastic licenses, which I guess technically could be created by hand. But there is some mystery as to why a person who purported to be Martin Bryant had a license Martin Ryan. So the SP1 then ended up in his possession and was the rifle that was ostensibly used at Port Arthur to devastating effect. But there is some question as to who sold it and where it ended up. When Garnett had basically sold the weapon and it had ended up supposedly at Seascape, David and Sally Martin, who were the owners of the Seascape Cottage, who were sadly and tragically murdered prior to the Port Arthur shooting at the penal colony, they had a son, Glenn Martin, and reports are that Glenn was a shooter and that he did own firearms. Once again, it's never really been determined what he owned, whether they were licensed, how many there were. In the resultant siege that occurred at the Seascape Cottage after the main shooting at Port Arthur, there were a number of firearms that were used from the cottage and basically recovered in the burnt wreckage once the cottage had burnt to the ground. There were reports that an SKS semi-automatic high-powered rifle with night vision equipment was utilised by the shooter at the cottage. An SKS was sort of like a cheap poor man's wooden version of an AK-47 to a certain extent. Not quite as sophisticated as an AK-47, but it was a semi-automatic rifle with high capacity magazine and very cheap to purchase. And something like 200,000 of them were imported into Australia and sold. They were a very popular rifle at the time. So an SKS was apparently used. It used the .223 caliber round, and there was also an SKK, which used the AK-47 round, which is 7.62 by 39, a sort of a more powerful caliber. There were other firearms ostensibly used, apparently bolt-action high-powered rifles and shotguns. The question is, who owned them? Were they owned by Glenn Martin? Did Martin have some friendship or understanding of Glenn that he might have had firearms stored at the Seascape Cottage and therefore chose that as the place to mount a siege? There's a lot of questions about what firearms were brought to Seascape and what were already there and then appropriated once the owners were killed. I did also have contradictory information that there were not a lot of firearms at the Seascape Cottage. It was run by an elderly couple, David and Sally Martin, and they might have had apparently some shotguns and just the .22 rifles for shooting rabbits, but there wasn't a large amount of firearms stored there. So it's once again, it's a bit of a mystery. I did hear also that Glenn used to buy ammunition by the carton and shoot beer cans off his boat in the bay, most likely using something like an SKS. So Glenn is a person I guess would be very good to talk to in relation to his ownership of firearms, how many there were, and also what happened to them after the fire. The weapons were mainly all burnt in the fire, so ostensibly they've been kept by the police, but as to what happened to them, that's another question. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Wasp Files. Feel free to share far and wide and see the attached files in support of the episode. Thank you.